We as economists have to move away from the idea of complaining about neoclassical economics or modifying it. It's not a question of imperfect competition, because perfect competition doesn't exist. It's a fantasy. So you cannot make the world real by saying the fantasy is not perfectly applied. It's a fantasy. And this unfortunately means that both orthodox economics, many great economists are modifying the basic framework, but also so do people on the left. You can detail, post-Keynesians, people say trade is not exactly free, and all of that, in my opinion, is correct in the observation, but false in the foundation. I'm Anwar Shaikh from the New School for Social Research, graduate faculty, Economics Department. My book on capitalism was motivated by my sense that the world that I saw could not be adequately explained by the economic theory that I was given. I actually came into economics as a person interested in development because I come from Pakistan and I lived in Kuwait. And Kuwait is one of the richest countries of the world and Pakistan is one of the poorest. And I thought that the issue was just an engineering issue. And then I came into graduate school at Columbia and I had best teachers, Gary Becker, Bill Vickery, and I realized that they were presenting a framework which made no sense to me as a description of social life or of economic life. And so I began to search for a framework, which admittedly took a long time. But as I assembled this giant jigsaw puzzle in my head, I would look to see, well, how do you explain international trade? How do you explain consumer behavior in a way that the explanations were consistent with each other? Much in the same way that Samuelson wrote his foundations, the idea was that the application should follow from a theory. So I'm broadly speaking working in the tradition of political economy because that tries to deal with social and historical circumstances within an analytical framework of economics. I have sort of four greats that I try to extract ideas from, but weave them together in a way that they're consistent and coherent internally, but also with the historical phenomena. And that's Smith, Ricardo, Marx, and Keynes. And what I try to show is that there is a framework that incorporates their understanding over long periods, applicable to the present, including Keynes, and that has certain implications which are lost over time. You have to remember that my early training was an engineer. So the thing with engineering is that you have to see how things actually work. You can't just work a bunch of equations. As an aeronautical engineer, for instance, you need theory. But in the end, you also know how the nuts and bolts fit, otherwise the rocket blows up. And so I was always concerned by the relation of theory to the actual practice. Now, if you think about that, the theory of perfect competition was essentially invented to idealize capitalism, to show it as firms as these passive, supremely responsible entities that respond to consumer behavior. But if you know anything about the history of firms and the history of capitalism, you know that's not true. They're always engaged in a war with each other, first of all. Then they are always engaged in a war with the things that cost them money, which is workers, raw materials, and so on. And it seemed to me that cannot be explained by saying this is monopoly. It was always true from the very beginning. So I drew also on the business literature. Business people totally understand that it's a war. And so from there, I was able to see that there were certain principles already embedded in the classical Marxian Keynesian tradition about these, which have mostly been ignored by economists because they get swamped by the idea of perfect competition or imperfect competition. And that's led me to construct this idea. And I had to call it something different than perfect competition. So it seemed to me real competition was a good name for it. I don't know anybody who optimizes anything. And anyone who tells you that is demented. So I studied psychology, I studied anthropology, and I looked at the business literature on consumers. I mean, if anybody knows how consumers work, it's business people whose job it is to sell you things. And it's pretty clear that we work on emotions, we work on culture, we work on influence, external and embedded. And so the question was, how do you incorporate these facts of gender, class, relation, nationality, all of that in your consumer behavior? And that would imply that your behavior is very, very complicated. But then I borrowed an idea, an astonishing idea that I got from my teacher, Gary Becker, which is that he demonstrated in class one day after we'd suffered for months with his equations and optimizing and all of that. It was an advanced graduate micro course. And he walked in one day and gave a lecture that showed that you don't need any of that. It's his famous 1963 paper, and he showed that you can derive basic arguments in microeconomics from what I think now as a stochastic approach. So you're focused on the aggregate, and we know that individuals have multiple complications, but in the aggregate, behavior is very predictable, which is what businesses know. So I used the Becker framework, extended it, and showed that I can derive basically all the observed laws of consumer microbehavior, Engels' curves, income elasticities, price elasticities, Keynesian consumption functions, from one thing alone, which is that everybody has a budget constraint, a limit to what they can spend, and that the aggregate behaves in a stable, stochastic way. And that turns out to be one of the fundamental principles of behavior. We cannot predict individual behavior, but we can predict pretty well what people do in the aggregate. Now, this breaks down if people choose to not do that. That is to say, if there's a moment in history or a moment in politics where people just abandon what they're doing and doing something different. But that's good, because that tells us then we can have to accommodate those kinds of changes, and we have to pay attention to people. There's one more point. I'm writing a new book. I'm going to make the point that the description of consumer behavior in economics is identical to that description in psychology called sociopathic behavior. Now, if you think about what a sociopath is, sociopath is someone who's concerned only with themselves and not with anyone else or anything else. They see the others as means to their end. That includes their parents and their friends. They don't really have friends, but that's a utility maximizing consumer. We encompass this in a mathematical form, and that mystifies people. But if I were to say verbally, look, you don't care about your mother, you don't care about your children, you don't care about your friends, what you care about the most you get for self, people would throw you out of the bar thinking that you were a lunatic, but actually you'd just be an economist. In developing my ideas, going from micro to macro, the linking theme was the idea that the firm, real competition, which we talked about before, is motivated by profitability. Why do firms do what they do? They do it because they aim to expand their market share. They cut their prices to beat their competitors. They used to burn down their warehouses. I don't know if you've seen the movie There Will Be Blood about the oil industry. It's perfectly legitimate, except it's frowned on these days. They steal from each other. So that's war. And what motivates them is the search for profit. And the search for profit meaning where they put their new investment. Now, their new investment, they look at the profitability in an industry and say, if I add some capital to it, what's my rate of return? If there's another industry that's a possibility, they compare the rates of return. And they compare them net of the interest rate, because the interest rate is the kind of base rate, what they call the cost of capital. Now, this seems like a little bit of a divergence, but it isn't, because this principle of mobility of capital across industries turns out also to be the principle driving investment over time. And so Keynes's idea that investment is driven by the profit rate minus the interest rate, marginal efficiency of capital, the profit rate on investment minus the interest rate, has directly follows from this framework. Of course, because you're making investment to the future, it's the expected profit rate. But the expected profit rate and the actual profit rate are related to each other. I take that idea from Soros, the idea of reflexivity, that you affect what you do by planning to do it, but if you go far enough from the fundamentals, then you're brought down. So I developed that formally, mathematically, in the Latin of my profession. And this then leads to an important question. If you expect things to be going up, you will actually cause a boom. If the state pumps up the economy by printing money or running deficits, you'll cause a boom. But if that boom leads to wages rising faster than productivity, that means the wage share rises, then the profit rate falls. And the profit rate is what motivates this growth of capital and growth of output over time. So what you're doing is pumping it up in one hand and undermining the foundation in another. When you do that, then the stimulus gets undone and you get a slowdown in growth. Now, this happened in the 70s in all over the advanced world. They went thinking they were doing Keynesian policies. They pumped up the economy. worked, unemployment went down, then the unemployment began to creep up because they didn't notice the profit rate was falling. And so they thought, well, let's pump some more. And they did that again. And what they got is increasing unemployment and inflation because the economy was not tight in the sense of unemployment, it was tight in the sense of profitability. And this explains the failure of Keynesian policies in the 70s. And I've also explained that this helps us understand how come Keynesian policies worked without this problem in previous periods. In a recent paper, I cite two instances. One is the tremendous expansion of Nazi Germany under Hitler, who eliminated unemployment within 1 year by massive deficits. But there was no inflation. There was no fall in profitability because Hitler also said to firms, you may not raise your prices unless you really want to say you're against us and the state and the German state. He also said to workers, you may not raise your wages. So the effect of not having prices rise and wages not rising meant that real wages were either constant, actually they fell, and profits rose. So the wage share fell, profit rate rose. So he cut the link between stimulus and falling profitability. Roosevelt did the same thing in World War II. Prices were frozen, interest rates were reduced, so the gap between profit and interest rate was expanded. Wages were not allowed to rise. And as a result, you've got this huge expansion without inflation, without slowdown of growth. But then, as soon as that ended, they mistook this for a free market thing. They allowed the market forces back in, and then they got, after a few years, this reversal of the stimulus. So if you want to stimulate an economy, you have to do more than just pump money into it. In looking at capitalism, you have to ask the question, how can capitalism have recurrent patterns, given that it mutates and evolves so quickly? And the answer is because the core of it, in fact, doesn't mutate, and the core is profitability. Firms still go from high wage to low wage areas, from high cost to low cost. And so, as the classicals did, the idea is to locate certain, not all, certain key impulses and patterns in the idea of profitability. I argue that that explains why those patterns exist, but then you have to show how those patterns derive from profitability. And so my theory of inflation, my theory of exchange rates, of interest rates, of the stock market, as well as macroeconomic stimulus and its possible limits, all come from this basic foundation. All right, so let me draw some implications from this. One is that you can develop other applications of this framework, such as why globalization works for some and doesn't for others. Trump and Sanders have emphasized how free trade does benefit some, but leaves others stranded. And that comes from the idea that free trade is not about people, it's about profitability. And profitability sometimes helps, sometimes doesn't. Environment, the same issue. Yes, firms develop all new technologies, and yes, they also engage in damage to the environment, and they push that damage because it's good for their benefits. Inequality is another issue where I argue that you can explain inequality in a very simple way. And here I'm basing myself on the works of Viktor Yakovenko and his co-authors on the idea that the inequality of wage income is a different character than the inequality of profit or of property income. And it's a formal thing. You do need some tools for that, but you can show it empirically very simply. It's true in every advanced countries, and it implies that if you want to change inequality at the level of the market, you have to change the balance between profits and wages. Also, you have to reduce financialization, which is the source of all these profits. All of these things are applications of a unified framework. That was my goal from the beginning. And I don't do anything unless I can show its connections by adding new information, perhaps, or new applications. And so I push for the idea that we should have space for developing an alternate framework. And that means not just a question of new economic thinking, if you forgive myself saying that, but a new economic framework, which is not the same thing as new economic framework. My book benefited greatly from support from INET and earlier from the Levy Institute. I would not have been able to finish it, but my task was not to have new takes on the same old applications as many people are doing, but rather say, why don't we start from a framework that is unified and see how it understands the world. And you typically get a different understanding, and that's a virtue of it. Cast aside your preconceptions, but don't cast aside your understanding of the socialness of life, of how we come to where we are, and resist the idea that math can be used to cloak the content of a theory. Yes, learn your math. I'm a strong believer that people should have it for some. Learn your econometrics, but don't get mystified by the Latin. Look what the real story is.